The low hum of polite conversation, the clinking of crystal, the soft, mournful notes of a string quartet, it was all meant to paint a picture of perfect, prenuptial bliss. The venue was an old converted barn, its rustic charm amplified by 1,000 fairy lights woven through the rafters, creating a golden cage of manufactured warmth. From my corner table, a seat I had chosen for its proximity to the exit, the rehearsal dinner for Hannah and Daniel looked like a scene meticulously styled for a magazine. Hannah, the bride-to-be, was a vision in a stark white silk dress, her laughter echoing a little too brightly, while Daniel, my childhood best friend, looked at her as if she'd personally hung the moon and stars. Everyone was playing their part beautifully. Everyone but me. I shouldn't have come. My name tag, written in an elegant, unfamiliar script, felt like a brand on my chest. The invitation had been a surprise, a thin, cream-colored envelope that felt more like a summons than a welcome. It had arrived without a return address, but I knew. Daniel had called the night before, his voice tight with a familiar, anxious energy. "It wouldn't be the same without you there, Soph," he'd pleaded. "Please." The unspoken second half of that sentence hung in the air between us. Hannah doesn't want you to come. So I came. For Daniel. But as I sat there, pushing a lone olive around my untouched appetizer plate, I could feel the weight of a dozen hostile stares. An Arctic front seemed to emanate from one table in particular, the one where Megan, Hannah's maid of honor and self-appointed guardian, presided. Her eyes, sharp and critical, had been tracking me since the moment I walked in. She and Hannah's other friends had formed an impenetrable sorority around the bride, their whispers and sharp sideways glances making it unequivocally clear that my presence was an unwelcome intrusion. I didn't try to bridge the gap. I knew my place. I was a ghost at this feast, a relic of a past that everyone, especially Hannah, was desperate to bury. Daniel and I had history, the kind that doesn't just fade with time but sinks into your bones. We had shared scraped knees on this very farmland, long before it was a wedding venue. We had shared family holidays, teenage secrets whispered under the covers, and a clumsy, heartfelt romance that had burned brightly through high school, and then, inevitably, burned out during our first year of college. We had managed to salvage a deep, unwavering friendship from the ashes, but it was a friendship Hannah could never quite accept. To her, I wasn't Sophie, the friend. I was the specter of a love that came before hers, a measuring stick she was convinced she'd never match. Daniel caught my eye from across the room. He offered a small, helpless shrug, a silent apology for the cold front I was enduring. I knew he was caught in the middle, torn between the woman he was about to marry and the friend who knew him before he was the man she fell in love with. Seeing that look on his face, that familiar flicker of guilt, solidified my decision. I had fulfilled my obligation. He was happy, truly, incandescently happy, and that's what I had come to see. I stood up, my movements quiet and deliberate, intending to slip out like the phantom I was. I'd already left my gift on the designated table by the entrance, a small, unassuming box wrapped in simple brown paper, dwarfed by the lavish, glittering offerings that surrounded it. No one had seen me place it there. It was a framed photograph of the old oak tree on the hill behind the barn, the one where Daniel and I had carved our initials inside a lopsided heart when we were 12. It was a memory from a world that no longer existed. I was almost at the massive barn door, the cool, clean scent of the August night just within reach, when a voice sliced through the noise, sharp as broken glass. "Leaving so soon?" It was Megan. She had detached herself from the bridal court and was now blocking my path, a triumphant smirk playing on her lips. Her arms were crossed, her posture a fortress of expensive fabric and utter disdain. "I just wanted to wish them well," I said softly, my voice barely a whisper. My throat felt tight. I didn't want to intrude. Her smirk widened. It was a cruel, practiced expression, one I was sure she'd perfected in boardrooms and backstabbing social circles. "Intrude," she repeated, loud enough for those nearby to pause their conversations. "Honey, that's an understatement." She leaned in, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial hiss that carried farther than a shout. "You shouldn't have come at all. You weren't even invited." The words struck me with the force of a physical blow. I could feel the blood drain from my face, then rush back with a hot, prickling shame. She wasn't wrong, not really. The invitation was an act of rogue sentimentality from Daniel, not a gesture approved by his bride. A small circle of silence had opened around us, a vacuum in the cheerful din. People were watching, their curiosity piqued by the unfolding drama. I saw Hannah glance over, her face a carefully blank mask, her eyes meeting mine for a fraction of a second, before quickly, deliberately, turning back to her friends. She wasn't going to save me. She was letting this happen. I didn't argue. I didn't defend myself. I just gave Megan a small, tired nod. There was nothing left to say. My humiliation was her trophy. But as I turned to leave, a wave of cold clarity washed over me. I paused. There was one last thing. I reached into my bag and pulled out a small, worn, leather-bound journal. It was old, its cover softened with age, and its pages filled with the looping, familiar handwriting of Daniel's mother, a woman I had loved like my own, a woman who had been gone for 5 long years. I walked not to Megan, but to the young waiter who was clearing a nearby table. I held the journal out to him, my hand perfectly steady. "Could you please make sure the bride gets this?" I asked, my voice clear now, imbued with a purpose that overrode the shame. "It's important." He nodded, his expression professionally neutral as he took the journal carefully. As I finally walked out the door, away from the fairy lights and the false laughter, I didn't look back. I didn't need to. I knew the contents of that journal. I knew the stories and the secrets held within its pages, written in a hand Daniel would recognize in a heartbeat. And I knew that once Hannah read it, nothing would ever be the same. What I had left behind was not a gift, but a truth that I was certain would make the bride change her seat. The gravel of the parking lot crunched under my sensible flats, a sound that roared in the sudden ringing silence where music had just been. The cool August air, thick with the scent of cut grass and damp earth, was a welcome shock against my heated skin. I didn't run. I walked, each step a deliberate, measured beat against the frantic thrumming in my chest. Behind me, the brightly lit barn was a perfect, curated diorama of a life I was no longer part of. The warm, buttery light spilled from its open doors, carrying the muffled, joyful sounds of a world that had just violently ejected me. I didn't belong there. The last 30 minutes had made that excruciatingly, brutally clear. In my rearview mirror, the barn and its happy glow shrank until it was just another quaint, glowing box in the vast, indifferent darkness of the countryside. My hands were a white-knuckled cage around the steering wheel. Humiliation was a bitter, metallic poison on my tongue. It wasn't just Megan's venom, her carefully chosen words like desperate and pity invite and still hanging on, delivered with a saccharine smile for the benefit of the other guests. It was the curious, pitying stares that followed me, the whispers that bloomed in her wake. But most of all, it was Hannah. It was the chilling, deliberate emptiness in her eyes when she looked at me, her friend's claws in my side, and then looked away. She had silently sanctioned the ambush. She hadn't just allowed her friend to maul me, she had wanted it. She wanted me gone, excised, erased, so the picture she was painting could be flawless. I drove the 20 miles back to my small, quiet apartment, the kind of place with creaky floorboards and a landlord who complains about the smell of turpentine. It was a universe away from the sprawling, renovated farmhouse she and Daniel now called home. As I unlocked my front door, the familiar scent of oil paint and linseed oil, the smell of my own life, my own work, my own solitude, wrapped around me like a comforting blanket. It was grounding. I didn't turn on the television or put on music. I sank onto my sofa in the dark, letting the distant city lights paint fractured stripes across the floorboards. The silence was my accomplice now, a quiet co-conspirator. What had I truly done? The journal hadn't been a premeditated weapon. It was a promise, heavy and sacred, that I had debated for weeks whether to fulfill. Daniel's mother, Eleanor, had given it to me a month before she passed away, her hand, thin and bird-like, trembling as she pressed the leather-bound book into mine. "He's not ready for this yet, Sophie," she'd whispered, her voice a reedy thread against the hum of her oxygen machine. "He sees the world in such bright, simple colors right now, but one day he'll need the shades of gray. One day he'll need to understand his own heart. Promise me you'll give it to him when he needs it most." And I had promised. For 5 years, the journal had lived in my nightstand, a sacred trust. I had read it, of course. Eleanor had insisted, so I would understand the nature of my promise. The pages were filled with her elegant, looping script, a testament not just to her fierce love for her son, but her fears for him. She wrote of his idealism, his tendency to love with a grand, cinematic passion that sometimes blinded him to the quieter, more essential truths of a partner's soul. She had written about me. "Sophie grounds him," one entry read. "She is his anchor to the earth. She sees the boy inside the man, and she isn't afraid of his shadows. I worry he will one day mistake a beautiful, shining reflection for the real thing." And she had written about Hannah, after meeting her only a handful of times. Her observations were sharp, layered with a mother's intuition. "She is lovely, Eleanor wrote, polished and bright as a new coin. She wants a life that looks a certain way, and she has decided Daniel is the handsome centerpiece. I pray he is not merely an acquisition. I pray she sees the boy who is terrified of thunderstorms and who still believes in wishing on stars. The journal wasn't an indictment, it was a map of Daniel's own heart, drawn by the person who knew its every coast and hidden cove. Giving it to Hannah wasn't an act of revenge. It was a desperate, last-ditch effort to fulfill my promise to Eleanor, to give Daniel the one thing he needed before making his own promise: the truth. Megan's cruelty was simply the final violent push, the proof that Eleanor's fears were not unfounded. Hannah needed to see the man she was marrying through his mother's eyes. And maybe, just maybe, she needed to see herself through them, too. My phone buzzed on the coffee table, its screen a sudden, sharp rectangle of light in the gloom. The name flashed, stark and demanding. Daniel. My breath hitched. I let it ring, a shrill, insistent sound in the quiet room. Twice. 3 times. My hand hovered over the screen. Finally, I answered, my voice emerging with a steadiness that surprised me. Hello, Daniel. Sophie? What the hell did you do? His voice wasn't just angry. It was worse. It was frayed, stretched thin with a panicked bewilderment I knew all too well. It was the sound he made when the world stopped behaving according to his beautiful, simple script. I left a wedding gift, I said, my tone even. For you and for Hannah. A journal? A dusty old book? Soph, what was in it? He demanded, his voice rising. Megan said you caused a scene, that you cornered Hannah and threatened her. Megan is a liar, I cut in, a sliver of ice entering my voice. She backed me into a corner and humiliated me in front of your friends and family, and your fiancé stood there and watched it happen. So I left. But before I did, I asked a waiter to give Hannah your mother's journal. That is all that happened. A beat of charged silence stretched down the line. I could hear his breathing, a ragged, unsteady sound. My mother's? He repeated, his voice dropping to a near whisper. Which one? The one she gave me, Daniel. The one she wanted you to have when you were ready. Why would you give it to her? The panic clawed its way back into his voice. Why tonight? Of all nights? Hannah's? She's locked herself in the guest room. She won't talk to me. She keeps saying, the seat is taken. What the hell does that even mean, Sophie? The seat is taken. A small, sad, involuntary smile touched my lips in the darkness. Eleanor. Of course. It was never about a physical chair at the wedding. It was about a place in his life, in his soul. The anchor. The person who saw the boy afraid of thunderstorms. The person who wasn't afraid of the shadows. You need to read it, Daniel, I said softly. Then you'll understand. I can't. She has it. And she won't come out. His panic was escalating into a full-blown tantrum. Sophie, just tell me what it says. No, I said, the calmness returning, solidifying into resolve. I had lit the fuse. The explosion was his to manage. I made a promise to your mother, Daniel. A long time ago. I kept it tonight. I'm sorry it had to be this way, but I kept my promise. I ended the call before he could plead or argue further, setting the phone back on the table. The silence of my apartment rushed back in, but it was different now. It wasn't empty. It was waiting. The beautiful, flawless picture had been cracked right down the middle. Now we would all have to see if it was a picture worth saving. I stood in the upstairs hallway of the farmhouse, the polished wood floors cool beneath my dress shoes, the muffled sounds of our rehearsal dinner, the clinking of glasses, the low thrum of a jazz playlist, the carefully modulated laughter of our friends and family, drifted up the stairs. It was a soundtrack to a life that felt, in the span of a single hour, like it was no longer mine. Hannah, please, I said, my hand flat against the cool, painted wood of the guest room door. Just talk to me. Open the door. There was no response. There hadn't been for 20 minutes. Just a heavy, unyielding silence that was more damning than any angry words she could have thrown at me. I could picture her in there, sitting on the edge of the antique 4-poster bed we'd picked out together, her face pale, her beautiful, carefully composed features shattered. My mind raced, replaying my phone call with Sophie. I kept a promise to your mother. It was so like her. So maddeningly, righteously Sophie. She always operated on a plane of moral clarity I could never seem to reach, a world of promises kept and difficult truths faced. I had loved her for it, and if I was honest, I had resented her for it too. It was exhausting living with a saint. Hannah was different. She was bright and effervescent, She didn't demand that I excavate my soul every evening. She wanted to build a beautiful life, and she'd made it clear she wanted to build it with me. It was a life that looked perfect on paper, a life I was proud of. Now, a single leather-bound journal had apparently ripped it to shreds. "What did she say to you?" I called through the door, my voice strained. "Hannah, whatever Megan told you, whatever Sophie did, it's not what she did." Hannah's voice emerged, thick and distorted by the door between us. "It's what your mother wrote." My mother. I felt a familiar pang of loss, sharp and sudden. My mother had been the quiet center of my world. Her approval was a currency I hadn't even realized I was still trying to earn. "What?" I asked, my forehead now resting against the door. "What did she write?" "She wrote about you," Hannah said, her voice trembling with a cold fury. "She wrote about what you need, who you are when no one is looking." A bitter, broken laugh escaped her. "And she wrote about me, or rather, her impression of me." I squeezed my eyes shut. I knew my mother's impressions. They were gentle in their delivery and devastating in their accuracy. She had a way of seeing past the performance, of finding the tiny hairline cracks in the facade. "She called me a beautiful reflection," Hannah said, her voice barely a whisper now. "She prayed that you weren't just a piece of my beautiful picture. She didn't think I could see the real you, Daniel, the boy who is afraid of thunderstorms." I recoiled from the door as if struck. The words were a ghost from my childhood, a secret I had only ever shared with two people, my mother and Sophie. The thunderstorms. It was a silly, childish fear that had never quite left me, a vulnerability I kept hidden beneath layers of confidence and success. Sophie used to hold my hand and tell me stories until the thunder passed. Hannah didn't even know. It had never occurred to me to tell her. "Hon, it's not like that," I started, but my own words sounded hollow. The lock on the door clicked, not open, but as if it were being tested. Then silence. I waited, my heart pounding against my ribs. After a moment, a dark shape appeared in the sliver of space at the bottom of the door. The journal. It slid across the polished floor and stopped a few inches from my feet. It was old, the brown leather worn smooth at the corners. My mother's elegant, familiar handwriting was on a small label on the cover. I stared at it, this thing that had detonated my life. It was a bomb and a map, a relic and a key. Downstairs, someone queued up a new song, something cheerful and innocuous. The party was continuing, oblivious. Slowly, I bent down and picked up the journal. My own story, told by the woman who had written the first chapter. And I had a sickening feeling that I was about to find out I'd been lying to myself about how it was supposed to end. I didn't go back downstairs. I couldn't. The sounds of the party, the life I was supposed to be celebrating, felt like a broadcast from a distant planet. I sat on the top step of the grand, curving staircase, the journal heavy in my hands. It felt both sacred and profane, a holy relic and an explosive device. For a long time, I just held it, tracing the worn pattern on the leather, feeling the ghost of my mother's touch. Then I opened it. Her script was just as I remembered, elegant, precise, with a slight forward slant, as if her thoughts were always leaning toward the future. The first few pages were about her garden, her friends, the simple joys and quiet frustrations of her life. And then there was me, page after page of me. She wrote about my triumphs and my failures, my stubborn pride and my secret insecurities, with a love that was as clear-eyed as it was unconditional. It was like seeing a portrait of my own soul, painted by the only person who had ever truly mastered its likeness. I read about the summer I was 15 and tried to build a go-kart from a lawnmower engine and sheer misguided optimism. "He has his father's ambition," she wrote, "and my unfortunate lack of mechanical skill. But oh, to see him believe so fiercely in his own creation. He will build beautiful things one day. I know it. I just hope he remembers that the strongest things are not always the shiniest." My throat tightened. I had forgotten all about that go-kart, which had spectacularly rattled itself to pieces in the driveway, but she had remembered. Then the entries shifted. Hannah arrived. My mother's descriptions were gentle, almost clinically so. She praised Hannah's beauty, her ambition, her impeccable taste. She described the way our house transformed under Hannah's touch, becoming more stylish, more elegant, more generic. "It is a lovely house," she wrote. "It looks like it's from a magazine. I confess I sometimes miss the clutter. I miss the proof of a life being lived, not just displayed." And then I found the passages Hannah must have read. the words that had sent her fleeing behind a locked door. I watched them tonight, hosting their first dinner party. They are a perfect couple. From a distance, they glitter. But up close, I see the strain. Daniel is performing the role of the perfect host, the perfect fiancé. He is watchful, attentive, saying all the right things. But his eyes seem tired. He is not at ease. He is holding his breath. And then, the final, devastating entry about her. I fear she has fallen in love with the life she can have with him, not with him. She sees the strong, successful man, the handsome centerpiece for her beautiful picture. Does she see the boy who is terrified of thunderstorms? Does she know that his favorite meal is still grilled cheese and tomato soup? Does she know that he hums, tunelessly and loudly, when he's truly happy? I feel a strange ache when I look at them. It feels like watching him hold a beautiful, fragile glass bird. He is so afraid of crushing it, he dare not hold it close enough to feel its warmth. I close the journal, the leather cool against my suddenly clammy hands. The silence in the hallway was absolute. I finally understood. The journal wasn't an attack on Hannah. It was a mirror held up to me. My mother hadn't been afraid that Hannah wasn't good enough for me. She had been afraid that I wasn't being honest with Hannah, or with myself. I had loved the idea of us. I had loved the beautiful picture we made. I had loved Hannah's brightness and her uncomplicated view of the world. But had I loved her? The real her, with her own fears and her own secret, messy truths? Or had I just been relieved that she never asked to see mine? Sophie had never stopped asking. That was the difference. Sophie didn't just know I was afraid of thunderstorms. She knew why. Slowly, I stood up and walked back to the guest room door. I knocked softly. Hannah? This time, the lock clicked open almost immediately. The door swung inward. She was standing by the window, silhouetted against the moonlit fields. Her face was tear-streaked, her makeup smudged. The perfect, polished bride was gone. In her place was a woman I felt, for the first time, that I was truly seeing. You read it? She said. It wasn't a question. I did. She gave a small, shuddering sigh. The seat is taken, Daniel. It always has been. I knew it, I think, from the very beginning. The way you talked about her, even when you weren't talking about her. I thought I could, I don't know, renovate, redecorate, build something so new and beautiful that the old foundation wouldn't matter. Her voice broke. But your mother was right. The foundation is everything. I crossed the room to stand beside her, not touching, just sharing the view of the dark, quiet landscape. I'm so sorry, Hannah, I said, and the words were inadequate, but they were all I had. I'm sorry I wasn't honest. With you, with myself. I wanted the beautiful picture, too. I wanted it so badly. It was a beautiful picture, she whispered, but it wasn't real. We aren't real. She finally turned to look at me, her eyes filled with a sad, clear acceptance. There's not going to be a wedding, is there? I met her gaze, and for the first time that night, I told the absolute truth. No, I said softly. There's not. An hour later, I stood before the dwindling, confused crowd of our closest friends and family. The music was off. The fairy lights seemed harsh and interrogatory. With Hannah's quiet blessing and her hand briefly, supportively, on my arm, I told them. My voice didn't shake. I announced that the wedding was canceled, that it was a mutual decision rooted in love and respect, and I apologized for bringing them all here on a false pretense. It was the hardest thing I'd ever had to do, and the most freeing. As our guests murmured and departed, leaving plates of half-eaten cake and wilting floral arrangements behind, a profound, painful quiet settled over the barn. The party was over. It was almost 2 a.m. when my headlights cut across the front of Sophie's apartment building. The light was on in her window, a small, warm square against the dark brick. I took the journal with me. She opened the door on my first knock, as if she'd been waiting. She was wearing an old, paint-splattered sweatshirt and leggings, her hair piled messily on her head. She looked exhausted and beautiful and real. She just looked at me, her eyes searching my face, waiting. I held out the journal. My mother wanted me to have this when I was ready, I said, my voice hoarse. I think I'm finally ready. To see the shades of gray. To see everything. Sophie's gaze fell to the journal in my hands, then rose back to my face. I saw a universe of emotions in her eyes. Pain, relief, forgiveness, and a deep, abiding sadness for the years we had lost to my own blindness. I'm so sorry, Soph, I whispered. For everything. For tonight. For not being the friend you deserved. For letting you be the ghost. She didn't answer right away. She just stepped back, pulling the door open wider in a silent invitation. I walked into the familiar, turpentine-scented air of her apartment, of her life. The silence between us wasn't empty or waiting anymore. It was settled. It was the quiet, calm air after a storm has finally broken. "The seat was never taken, Daniel," she said softly, closing the door behind us. "It was just waiting for you to be ready to sit down."